So in this video, it would be interesting to talk a little bit about Sanskrit on the heels of our discussion, say, of Latin and Greek and some of this historical linguistics, maybe how that relates to the study of European languages and to practical issues of language learning. To maybe bring in some references to literature, people reading through, say, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, right, are confronted by, it's a very learned poem. He's an author educated in the British system at the turn of American British system at the turn of the 20th century, writes, references to modern European languages. There's Latin in there, there's Greek in there. And then you're hit with a couple of lines with Sanskrit words. Mm-hmm. Shanti, shanti, shanti in there. Mm-hmm. What's going on with Sanskrit? How does someone whose education is so very Western, so to speak, end up studying Sanskrit? Is there some connection to the study of Sanskrit that starts occurring in that particular period of time? What do you know about that, and what's your own story with respect to Sanskrit?
Absolutely, absolutely. Very fascinating questions and issues. And when you talk about Sanskrit, I think there was a period in history, it's maybe a blip in history, when I think Sanskrit was much more commonly known and studied than it is today in the Western world. Obviously, Sanskrit's the classical and literary language of India. It plays a role perfectly analogous to, say, Latin in Western civilization. It's even older and has a longer tradition there. Obviously, Indians in Indian civilization and culture have used it nonstop since about 1,500 BC, shall we say. So it's got a very long tradition, but Westerners did not know about it until about 1780, when an English judge in India named William Jones was the first person to take the time to study it, and he had a thorough education in Latin and Greek, and also in some, I think, Norse, Gothic and Old Norse and other languages as well. And he just studied it out of respect for the culture where he was living and interest in it. And then he noticed that there were all sorts of parallels, particularly with Greek and Latin and Norse and the older languages. And he noticed it was a real family relationship there. And so this really sort of kicked off the whole science of comparative philology and comparative historical linguistics, and seeing how languages are related to each other and how they grow and are connected and that kind of thing. And I think that there was a time period in the 19th century when people who had any sort of scholarship or good scholarly training would have had not just Latin and Greek, but also Sanskrit as well. And so there's a lot of sort of knowledge of it. So somebody like T.S. Eliot would find references of that. So those are some of the it's something that people can study and are able to study in our civilization now from another civilization that's their sort of classical literary language. So it offers fascinating vistas into many things. I know you had other points in your question, but it was a very big question. Am I answering the direction you were looking for? Can you ask more details? Where would you like me to take this?
Right. Yeah, no, that's good. And I'd like to circle back eventually. I kind of just tacked on at the end a little bit of your story with the learning Sanskrit, but I think that would be good to come back to later. For now, actually, I'm interested in helping out our listeners who might not actually know much about Sanskrit at all. Someone who hears Greek thinks automatically, okay, this is the language of Plato, Aristotle, the Iliad, the Odyssey. I kind of know what's going on a little bit with that. Same thing with Latin. With Sanskrit, what are we talking about? What are the classic texts in that language? What are some of the highlights of Sanskrit? And is it still a living language? Is it dead like Latin and Greek? Can you just give us a sort of primer on what Sanskrit is?
Sure. So Sanskrit is, like ancient Greek, has periods and epochs, and Sanskrit is the oldest form of Sanskrit. We call it Vedic Sanskrit, and that's roughly about 1,500 BC. People can look at it and know the state of the language, but it wasn't written down for a long time. They didn't believe in writing things. They memorized it was called Vedic Sanskrit, the Vedas, the Rig Vedas, and other sacred texts of what we call Hinduism, were all chanted and memorized and then later on written down in this form of Sanskrit. And so apart from purely religious texts, there are a lot of philosophical texts like the Upanishads and other things that were written in Sanskrit or memorized for a long time and then written down. Apart from that, there's a strong tradition of classical Sanskrit dramas and yes, great epics like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana are composed mainly in Sanskrit, or those are the oldest versions of it. So there's an incredible body of literature, and because it was the language of learning too, I'm sure there are many, many other kinds of forms and texts analogous to, say, 15th, 16th century Latin use as the scholarly language and throughout Europe that was filled that role in India. So, yes.
Yeah, so is Sanskrit then still used today in, say, religious services? Is it like Latin? Is it the ancestor to some of the modern Indian languages? What's its relationship?
It's perfect analogy to Latin, to the Romance languages, to Sanskrit, to the Indic languages. So just as Latin is the mother of Italian and French and Spanish and Portuguese and Romanian and Catalan and Occitan, so Sanskrit is the mother of Hindi and Bengali and Gujarati and Punjabi and Marathi and many other northern Indian languages. Sanskrit itself, I would say, is probably just as Latin was more alive, more widely used, say 300 or 400 years ago. I think Sanskrit is probably more like that in India. There have been efforts, it's an official language of India, and there have been efforts to get people to actually speak it in everyday life in a couple of villages. I don't know how much those have succeeded, but it's probably more vigorous in Indian culture today than Latin is now, maybe the way Latin was a couple of hundred years ago.
Something we touched on, I think we might have discussed Sanskrit very briefly in one of your earlier videos, where we talked about this notion of interrelatedness between languages. We mentioned the broader Indo-European language family. Mm-hmm. So someone looking at the script, say, of Sanskrit and of Spanish is not going to see, a resemblance immediately. How does that relatedness manifest itself? Does someone who has studied, say, Greek or Latin, when they turn to study Sanskrit, are they at any advantage at all? Is it going to be completely different? Will they be struck by anything similar? How does that work?
Definitely. You just take the like family names, Matar, Pitar, his mother and father, Baradar, his brother, and you have many cognate words as well, many things that you can recognize, and the grammatical system is quite similar to Latin and Greek. So if you studied Latin and Greek, learning Sanskrit should not be a huge challenge. You'll see many familiar friends in many ways, the ways that it's structured. It's a bit more complex. It has features that are more archaic. It's an older language. There's different forms of it. You have to learn a different script. It's not without its challenges, but if you've learned Latin and Greek, you won't find it terribly difficult.
So then coming back to the initial question and before moving on, what's your own experience studying Sanskrit? How did you decide to add this to your repertoire?
Well, I really enjoyed learning Latin and Greek intensively in college, and just sort of whetted my appetite for that kind of thing. And I just had kind of been poking around in the library, and I found a curriculum for a major that didn't exist anymore in my day, in the early 80s. This was about 100 years before that, maybe in the 1880s or 1890s, about the turn of the 20th century. You could major in comparative philology, and there was an expectation that you would sort of come in with strong enough Latin and Greek that you could start studying Sanskrit, and they had a sort of program for doing Sanskrit, and also adding in some older Germanic languages like the sequence of Old English, Middle English, and you were also expected to be learning French and German. It was a very language-intensive program, and that's kind of what I wanted to do, but it didn't exist anymore. So I thought, well, I'll just sort of give myself as much of this as I can. So I was able to sign up for Sanskrit as a college student. That's where I first studied it. Using the Whitman and Len grammar and Lemon's reader, and just sort of plunging right into the text. It was very, very challenging, but very fascinating, very interesting. I just remember being totally immersed in it, and sort of did about a couple of years of that there, and then somehow didn't touch it very much in graduate school. I was doing other things, but I never forgot it, and I had a couple of periods of going back and immersing myself in it for a year or so at a time, sort of, and again, there's so much to read in it, and there's a lot of really good didactic materials that you can get your hands in. It's sort of it is complex to learn, but it's also sort of user friendly in terms of finding materials that you can really use to teach yourself. There's tons of books like the Upanishads that have almost a word for word. They've got the glossary underneath it in English and in Hindi. So it's a very sort of language. There's a lot of material that you can pick up fairly easily once you've given yourself a basis. Like I said, if you've got Latin and Greek, then it shouldn't be terribly challenging.
Well, then maybe you could say a little bit to someone who's considering expanding their language repertoire, say, beyond the European languages. In a way, India and the historic region where Sanskrit was in use, that seems fairly far away, at a far remove. Someone wants to sort of gradually expand outward from where Greek and Latin were in use. There seems to be Persian in the middle, a lot of the Turkic languages in the middle. What's the connection between the study of the European languages, the study of Sanskrit? Are we skipping over a lot that went on in the middle? If we go straight from Greek and Latin to Sanskrit, is Sanskrit, or the culture in which Sanskrit was used, is that mediated to Europe, historically speaking, through that intervening region of Persia and Central Asia? Just could you sketch a general outline of?
Yeah, no, there's as you put it, there's plenty of stuff in between. And if you wanted to say I've got sort of a comprehensive overview of culture in this geographic region, if you knew India and Europe, yes, you'd have a big blank spot in the middle. It doesn't sort of fill in anymore there. You would need to know Persian and the Turkic languages, like we said, and other languages like Georgian and Armenian, and just to really sort of know that whole region there. But we call them Indo-European languages because they go from India to Europe, and so it's sort of the farthest fringes of related language families. You won't find sort of Indo-European languages more into China. I think Hittite got over there, but it's fixed in India. But the thought is that it's very closely related to the ancient Iranian languages, and so a lot of interesting studies have been done in the comparative history of religions in terms of the ancient mythologies, the relationship between the names of the gods and the myths and the legends of the Indians and the Persians and the Greeks, and there's a lot of parallels and relationships there. So it's quite interesting if you're interested in that kind of material.
Maybe as a point of motivation to someone who might be considering studying the language or not, or wants to study some other ancient language, what have you personally found most enriching about studying Sanskrit in terms of literature, in terms of just knowing a new language, understanding grammar? What have been the highlights of Sanskrit for you?
The script that it's usually written in, the Devanagari script, is just incredibly beautiful. And when you can actually read that with some fluidity, it's a very nice feeling. Sanskrit is complicated because you have the words aren't separated necessarily the way they are in Latin or Greek or European languages. They can run together as blocks. So you're seeing these big blocks of letters, and if you don't know where the individual words are, you don't know how to read them. But when you get better and you know how to read them, it just flows very nicely. It's just a very nice feeling to look at that sort of aesthetically beautiful script system that's totally different and be able to sound it out. There's any number of fascinating things to read in Sanskrit, and maybe I'll enjoy some of the more complex, longer mythological legendary things like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata when I get better myself, which I do aspire to do. But there's also these whole wonderful traditions of tales, of stories that are just really, I think, make the imagination very fertile. And there are things that are sort of made their way west ultimately as Kalila Wadimna, or as Arabic tales that come into Spain, and are taken through Persia ultimately come from a Sanskrit root, and there are things like the Hitopadesha and the Panchatantra, and they're just these tales of animals, speaking animals that have like wisdom and lore to learn from them, and they're just vast quantities. There's another book called the Sea of the Ocean of Tales. It's just this endless source ultimately of things that inspire the Arabian Nights and any sort of imaginative, legendary type tradition. So it's just very, very rich in all of that.
Okay, so maybe to phrase a concluding question toward a practical aspect of learning the language. Well, first, something that came to mind as you were speaking of philology earlier, getting interested in Sanskrit through a program that no longer existed. Coming through the university system more recently, it does seem to me that there's a little bit of an uptick in interest in reviving or reclaiming aspects of philology.
Mm-hmm.
At Columbia, there is a center that for world philology now that's encouraging this study. So it'll be interesting to see how these philological strands and interest in world civilizations do develop in the next few decades. But to conclude with a practical question, where should someone start? You mentioned some resources in your own learning of this language. Where should someone today turn to start learning Sanskrit?
Oh gosh. Well, the ones I mentioned, there's this sort of, if you want to go into the old philological tradition, there's it's Whitney's Grammar and Landman's Reader, and they're sort of keyed to go together. The way you just open it up and you start reading, and you're supposed to plug in, and there's notes and everything is glossed, and that's you can just sort of, if you want to just sink or swim, you can just throw yourself into it. That's the tried and true way. There's any number of good books for teaching yourself Sanskrit, such as Teach Yourself Sanskrit by Michael Coulson, which is pretty heavy in sort of the dramatic tradition. Classical drama is most where most of the examples are taken from, but that's a very good, clear exposition. I think that got me started. We're using, in the Sanskrit circle that I have in the academy, we're using Maurer's Reader right now from the University, I think, of Hawaii Press. It's an old 2-volume red thing. It's now available as 1-volume edition, but that has very good vocabulary keyed to interesting texts taken from this whole legendary tradition of the princes and kings of ancient India. So that gets you into reading quite quickly. But as I said, there's any number probably of other of good books out there to learn from. But once you sort of get a foothold in it, as I said, there's any number of texts of the philosophical tradition and the religious tradition that have are designed to help people read, and so they've got a lot of vocabulary help and the like. So there's a wide variety of things to start reading right off the bat. Okay. Well, thank you for asking me these great questions as usual, and thank you, anybody who listened and likes to listen to me talk about these kind of things. If you do enjoy that, I encourage you to come and take a sample class or two in my academy. I've got room for a person or two in a lot of circles. And I know a lot of people feel, maybe I'm not good enough, but the way you get good enough is by participating. So come and see, and if you're not, maybe you want to come back a little later on, but maybe you'll be interested. We've got Sanskrit going. If you like hearing about Sanskrit, come see what we do about Sanskrit. You're welcome. Thank you.